There's a lot of very comfortable, relaxed, tolerant, pleasant, kind interactions between men and women. But that should not blind us to the fact that if there is conflict between men as a whole and women as a whole, men invariably win. That the religions are basically male biased, and that politics is male biased, and the law. And if you survey the law of small scale societies like hunters and gatherers, you find that it is invariably biased in favor of the men.
Hello guys, welcome to this episode of Little Brains Big Topics, the best podcast in the observable universe. Yeah, I'm serious about that. In this episode we have Richard Wrangham. Very fascinating interview. I fully encourage all of you to watch till the end. And yeah, also first of all, reminder, if you haven't subscribed on YouTube, or if you don't follow us on whatever podcast platform you're listening on, please make sure to do that right now. And yeah, leave us a positive review on iTunes as well, if you don't mind. Right, so I'll read to you who Richard Wrangham is, the topics we cover, and then we'll jump right into the interview. So Richard Wrangham is an English anthropologist and primatologist. His research and writing have involved ape behavior, human evolution, violence, and cooking. Two of his most prominent books are Catching Fire and The Goodness Paradox. The links to both of those can be found in the description of this episode. So some of the topics we cover are biological anthropology, what makes humans unique. We cover importance of fire at making us human, use of fire at increasing our brain size, and how our biology is dependent on our culture. We discuss what makes Homo sapiens unique. We talk about Homo erectus and Neanderthals as well. We discuss the difference between roles of men and women in hunter-gatherer societies, relationships in hunter-gatherer societies, why all human societies have been patriarchal, and the possibility of having matriarchal societies. And finally, we discuss whether Professor Wrangham has said anything controversial in the past. We'll discuss all of those in this episode of Little Brains Big Topics. Just a few reminders that for any suggestions, if you have for future episodes, you can find us at big_topics. And we have Patreon. The links to Patreon can be found in the description of this video as well. Hope you guys enjoy the episode. Could you tell us about what anthropologists do and the challenges you have in trying to understand our ancestors?
Well, I'm a biological anthropologist, and I think of that as covering the story of how we got here, how humans end up on Earth. So that engages paleontology, archaeology, the direct evidence about our ancestry. It engages an understanding of primates, our closest living relatives, in order to work out what similarities we have with them and what differences, and either way, how the similarities or differences came to be. And it involves studies of living people. And the studies of living people can be all sorts of things, but one of the most fascinating is where we have evidence about the hunting and gathering way of life, which is something that our ancestors had until agriculture, something like 10,000 years ago. And then, of course, this this three-way examination of our ancestry through direct evidence, through comparative evidence with primates, and through living peoples is amplified or is made possible through all sorts of different techniques. Very important one this century being genetics, and all sorts of other studies of the biological systems.
And what do you think makes humans different from other animals? So, and by humans, I'm referring to the Homo chain, not necessarily the Sapiens.
So Homo as a genus.
As the genus, yes.
The genus. So Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species, and Homo sapiens is somewhere around 250,000 years old. People are now pushing it a little bit further back into the 300,000s. The Homo genus, which includes all sorts of other species as well, that goes back about 2 million years. And so your question is, what makes us human in the sense of what makes Homo different? And the description, I mean, the sort of simplest way to think about it is that all the members of the genus Homo were like humans in being bipedal, standing upright, being poor climbers, having arms that are not nearly as good as those of chimpanzees in being able to hang from branches or climb rapidly. So we have the basic size and shape that would allow you to walk down the high street of any town and pop into a clothing store and find clothes off the peg. What makes Homo in terms of our behavior? It's hard to know exactly about the behavior of Homo erectus, of course, which is the first full member of the genus Homo about 1.9 million years ago. But the general expectation is that given the size of their brains and the evidence that we can put together, they were hunting, they were gathering, they were living in small social groups, a bit like the social groups of hunters and gatherers that we see nowadays.
And so, obviously, Homo erectus were around for a long time, weren't they?
Yeah, until something like 100,000 years ago.
Wow. So they did pretty well for themselves.
Homo erectus flourished, absolutely. They were in Africa was where they started, but then within a very short time, they got to Indonesia. So there are records of Homo erectus in Indonesia 1.8 million years ago. So
Wow.
they were there within 100,000 years.
Wow.
And particularly in East Asia, they stayed there for a long time. I can't remember exactly when they died out. I said 100,000 years ago. I think it's about that time when Homo sapiens reached those parts. And that was, Homo sapiens reached there something like 50 or 60,000 years ago. So Homo erectus is very successful indeed. That's right.
Did they coexist with humans at any time, Homo erectus, no, with sapiens?
Yes, absolutely. They coexisted. So sapiens, say if you call sapiens starting at 300,000 years ago, then for something like 200,000 years, they coexisted. They didn't coexist in the same place.
Right.
So
they coexisted in time, not in place.
In time, that's right. So at that point, erectus was in the east, in Southeast Asia, and sapiens was in Africa and making repeated ventures into what we now think of as the Middle East, and then eventually Europe.
And do we know of any? So So Homo erectus, I guess, coexisted with the Neanderthals and Denisovans as well.
Yes, so Neanderthals broke off from the line with Sapiens something maybe 600,000 years ago, that sort of thing.
Right, so they descended from Homo erectus, Neanderthals.
Most people would say they descended from Homo heidelbergensis. So Erectus gave rise in Africa to heidelbergensis. That is a form with a slightly bigger brain, small changes in the skull that you see evidence of around 600 to 800,000 years ago. And most people would say that heidelbergensis gave rise to two forms, sapiens within Africa and Neanderthals, which went into Europe.
And how much do we know about all these different species of humans? Do we know how they did they have language? Did they have culture? Did they have religion? How did they? What groups did they divide themselves into? Do we know any of those things about them?
We know a lot less about their behavior than we do about their relationships, their phylogeny, their evolutionary relationship. And of course, language is one of the great puzzles. It's very difficult to find any way that gives you a clear indication of how much language any population, any species had. So the short answer is we don't know. And there are people who think that relatively full-blown language goes back maybe even all the way to Homo erectus. And there are other people who think it's much more recent. I'm one of the people who think that full-blown language is much more recent. I think it began with Sapiens, and I think it accounts for the evolution of Sapiens. But we don't know. With regard to culture, the material forms of culture, Sapiens and Neanderthals were in many ways very similar. So you see a lot of things that Neanderthals did that were very similar to what Sapiens did, particularly with regard to the use of stone tools, and to some extent with bone tools, and a little bit of evidence of art. The thing about Neanderthals is that although the record for Neanderthals is pretty good in terms of their bones, the frequency with which they are showing evidence of Sapiens-like culture tends to be rather low. So there's something that just seems a little bit different. Now, again, you've got some people who say that there's basically no difference culturally between Neanderthals and Sapiens, based on the fact that a lot of the kinds of tools that are left behind by Sapiens can be found occasionally with Neanderthals. There are others who will point to the differences and say Sapiens was clearly much more elaborate in terms of their culture than Neanderthals. Prior to those two, when you go back to Heidelbergensis and Erectus, then things are simpler.
Right, if you go further back enough.
Yeah.
Then you know for a fact.
Well, yes, I mean, so the stone tools that Heidelbergensis was using were clearly of an earlier level of sophistication. So they did not have the Levallois technique that seems particularly important. And actually, the Levallois technique does not really seem to have been used, I think, by Neanderthals either. So that was something that's very much associated with Sapiens, a technique where you can reconstruct that what the people are doing is looking at a stone and imagining the tools that you're going to be able to get out right from the middle of it and chipping away at it in order to get out what's in the middle, rather than just hitting it and hoping that something useful comes off. So in other words, very well anticipated approach to obtaining their tools. Another thing that's very different about Sapiens is that there are no indications in Neanderthals of arrowheads. So it's only with Sapiens that you get an indication of actually any kind of projectile weapon, things that you can imagine being flung through the air, so through a distance. And that would give Sapiens great advantages in terms of efficiency of hunting, whether using literally bows and arrows or using spear throwers. An atlatl, do you know what that is? It's kind of a tool that gives a mechanical advantage to using a spear. A bit of wood where you can hook the base of the spear into it and then throw, and it'll give great additional force to the spear thrust. So these are things that would have given them Sapiens advantage in hunting, but presumably also in aggression against members of either their own species or another species, such as Neanderthals.
And would you attribute high intelligence to, well, we know you've written a book on cooking and intelligence. So that book is about the humans, isn't it? It started 2 million years ago, the cooking process.
Yeah, you're talking about Catching Fire.
Yes.
It's called Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. And so the argument in that is that at the present, there is no alternative explanation for the evolution of Homo erectus at around 1.9 million years ago, other than that they were able to control fire and use it to cook, as well as to use the fire to protect themselves from predators and so on. So, the argument is that if you look at the adaptations of Homo erectus compared to the earlier ancestors, what you see is a species that is got a relatively small gut, and yet is eating both vegetable foods and meat. And if they are not cooking, they would have to have a large gut to digest those raw vegetable foods. So the fact they have a small gut and small teeth means that they are somehow able to get away without eating raw vegetable foods. And I think the only plausible answer is that they were eating cooked vegetable foods. And in addition, they had abandoned the long adaptation to climbing in trees, as evidenced by now the fact that instead of having ape-like shoulders that would enable them to hang from branches and so on, they had shoulders like us, which means that climbing in trees is possible but awkward, and not the kind of thing that you want to be able to do on a regular basis for sleeping. So they must have slept on the ground. And if to sleep on the ground would be absolutely crazy unless you've got a good way of defending yourself at night from all the things that can bump into you, whether it's elephants or lions. And in other words, they had fire. So, I would never think about going and bedding down in the Serengeti nowadays without fire, even though the animals generally are afraid of humans. And I think that's the way it would have been for Homo erectus. So I think that Homo erectus was the first species that was committed to using fire. That commitment meant that they were doing it all the time. They could not have adapted with small guts, small teeth, and lack of climbing ability unless they could guarantee using fire all the time.
So that would have a really interesting implication that so fire, there is nothing instinctive in us to know how to create fire. It's a knowledge. It's something you learn.
Absolutely.
So does that mean that like one generation of them learned how to use fire, and over the span of 2 million years, they moved that knowledge, they told each other generation by generation?
Yeah, I think that that's right. The the practice of making fire has been so important that generation by generation, everybody has learned how to do it from the previous generation. So we have relied entirely on our cultural ability to be able to be adapted to something completely vital. So you've got this lovely two-way interaction between culture and biology through fire. Because on the one hand, we have remained cultural in the sense that you pointed out, that we have to learn how to make fire in every generation. On the other hand, it's been taken into our biology because we could not now exist without fire. Our biology has become adapted to it in such a way that if you took anybody living on Earth and put them into the wilds, then they would die out. You would not get a living population. This is the evidence that we can draw from studies of living people and comparison with primates and so on, that it is impossible for humans to live on raw wild food. So our biology depends on our culture.
And all the hunter-gatherer indigenous societies that we have records of, they all knew how to make fire.
Well, it is certainly the case that they all knew how to make fire in one sense, which is they know that if you can see someone else's fire, then you can put some fuel on it and take that fuel away and make your own fire.
Right. Okay.
And so that is a way to get fire. And that may be all that humans actually need, because even though fires do go out, hunter-gatherers are famous for being extremely nervous about letting fires go out. So, I had a student who was spent a few months with Bushmen in southern Africa at a time when they were living off the land. And every day what would happen is that they would wake up and would put dirt around their fire in a way that would just keep it smoldering all day. And then they would go off and forage and hunt and so on, and then come back in the evening and just blow the fire up. It would still come back to flame quite quickly. But one day, this guy, his fire went out. And so he came back and the fire wasn't there. Now everyone else's fire was there, so that was fine. But oh my goodness, those women, they said, "You are a bad person. You let your fire go out. You must never, never, never do that." And I've heard stories about why it's so important. I've heard stories about Australian Aboriginals whose fire went out because of a thunderstorm and died 2 weeks later because they could not start a fire at that time. Now, the ones who in that case died out or died were old people who could not walk far. And what happened was that the party whose fire, they were on a big trip, a big journey. And so they were far from home. A big thunderstorm wiped out their fire. And some of them set off. And they set off, and it took them a long time to get to a place where there was fire. But they got to it. And what it was that? It was a place where there were other people. Now, this was in the middle of the West Australian desert, which is a huge uninhabited area. And so when they came back to find the ones who had been left behind, those ones were dead. Wow. So that shows the importance of fire, and it shows that it's much better if you can make it. But the ones who were able to move at all, they did survive, and because they could go somewhere else. And what the great ethnographer of Australia, Norman Tyndale, recorded was that people would walk up to 40 kilometers to go and find fire, and from a long distance they could smell fire. They could smell smoke and go there. And then, the great thing about fire, of course, is that for someone giving it, it's no cost to them at all. So you get this huge benefit, but no cost. Sure, take a log from my fire, or put your log in and just let it burn.
Do we know if the frequency of fires happening at random are sufficiently high to accommodate that kind of lifestyle?
I don't think, lightning fires, you mean?
Yes, yes.
I'm not sure I've ever seen statistics on it, but I'm quite sure that they're not. They're not frequent enough.
Right.
Now, there are people who have suggested that at the time that around 2 million years ago, when some of us think that humans were learning to control fire, that they may have been in areas where there was a particularly high level of fires starting naturally due to volcanism, due to volcanic activity. So humans were living in a very volcano-rich zone. There was a lot of volcano activity in northeastern Africa 2 million years ago, and possibly there were lots of fires being started by volcanic activity, by lava coming out and just burning in the local areas. But I think it's a reach. For me, once humans have been able to control fire that initially maybe was natural, once they could learn to make fire from each other, then a local population, you will never have fire go out, because even though thunderstorms will come through, you will always find someone a few kilometers, a few miles away that does have fire, and you can go and get it from them.
Is it possible that over the span of the 2 million years, all the fires originated from one fire?
No, I don't think so.
Right.
That's a wonderful concept, but clearly people did learn how to make fire for themselves.
Right.
And one lovely example is an analysis of striation marks on hand axes. So the hand axe is that pear-shaped, something sort of 6-inch long, that sort of thing, tool that became widespread from 1.6, 1.7 million years ago onwards, and continued to be used for pretty much until Homo sapiens. And even now you can find hand axes in the areas that are used by some hunter-gatherers. Who knows how long they were carried on being used. Well, there were striations on these that people have interpreted as a way to start a fire. These are flint, and if you strike them with an iron-rich ore, a little lump of some kind of iron pyrites, then it produces sparks that are sufficiently hot and long-lasting that they are very good for starting a fire with. Well, I'm not sure what the oldest hand axes are that are flint and have had the marks on them to show this, but they're in the last few 100,000 years. And so I think that's the oldest direct evidence of people being able to make fire.
And do you think also that use of fire for cooking allowed our brains to get so big?
Yes, I think that one of the consequences, multiple consequences of using fire is that in making food more digestible, it increases the predictability of being able to get a regular supply of food. And it means that there is the opportunity for an animal that has relatively high metabolic needs to get those needs satisfied every day without endless chewing. So our brains, when we're sitting around just not doing very much, our brains use around a quarter of all of the energy that we are using to maintain our metabolism. So the brain weighs about 2.5% of your body, depending on exactly what size you are, and it will use something 20 to 25% of all of the energy. Every fifth hamburger that you eat goes just to your brain.
Wow. And that ratio is very high for humans, isn't it?
Yes, it's much higher for humans than for any other species. And so this reflects the fact that we have a greater need for metabolic supply, energy supply for our brains. We cannot afford ever to let them stop, because if you do that, you die. You know, we're not like computers. Computers you can turn off and turn on again. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for brains. So even at night, you're using your brain.
Very interesting.
The humans are also relatively well endowed with fat. We have a percentage of fat in our bodies that is higher than in any of our close relatives. And that's probably another way in which we are able to have the luxury of a large brain, because it means that even when we can't on any one day get enough food, we have the fat supplies to be able to mobilize to supply our brain with ultimately glucose. And that again may be possible because we eat highly digestible food. Because it's cooked, we don't have to use a lot of energy to digest it, and therefore we can shunt off the excess energy into fat.
Wow. So what would you say? So I know we've touched on this a little bit, but what would you say are some of the most distinct characteristics of sapiens?
Well, when you compare us with our earlier ancestors, then the typical thing that, the classic canonical answer to that is, well, our brains have got a little bit bigger and probably we are just that much smarter. A closely related version of that is that we were more cultural. Our culture has developed increasingly. And you asked earlier about religion. It's only in recent sapiens, within the last 25,000 years, that you see these wonderful cave paintings that indicate, certainly some suggestion of some pretty deep religious feelings. So those are the two ordinary answers. And then a third sort of classic answer is that if you look at our skulls and skeletons, we are more lightly built than our more robust ancestors, which most people would call Homo heidelbergensis. And it's true in comparison with Neanderthals and Erectus as well. We are just a more lightly built species. And a classic explanation for that is that we were using our increasingly inventive intelligence, our increasingly sophisticated culture, to do things with tools that previously would have engaged our brawn, our strong muscular bodies. So we were able to use our projectile weapons to kill animals at a distance, and therefore we have to spend less time actually grappling up with them close up, and therefore we can afford to be more gracile, less robust.
Is it?
I think so, those three things, because those are the classic ways of thinking about them. I'll give you a fourth, which I think is fully as important as all the rest of them, and that is the idea that we became reduced in aggressiveness, and the way I would describe that is we became more like a domesticated animal.
We'll definitely get to that.
Okay.
So do you think it's possible the reason we're more fragile than maybe other species is that our bodies spend more energy in the brain and less into muscles and giving us making us stronger?
Well, it's true there's a little bit of a trade-off in that direction, in the sense that we do commit less energy to our musculature, to judge from the way in which we have reconstructed the musculature of Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and so on. But I don't think that I don't think the logic works that we needed a bigger brain, we put energy into our brain, and we just put up with having more gracile bodies. If we needed to have those robust bodies, we would have them.
Right.
We can get away with them now, not because we simply can't afford them, but because there's something about the way in which we live, which means that we don't need the robust bodies anymore.
Right, so it's because we don't need it. It's because it's not actively needed. We lose it over time. It's not that it's a direct trade-off.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And not to anticipate it too much, but I think again it's because we are a less aggressive species, and therefore we can afford not to have to defend ourselves so well in physical fights against members of our own species.
Fascinating. So how do you think the roles of men and women differ in human societies? And I mean like the hunter-gatherer societies. How did their roles differ?
Well, there's a very consistent pattern in terms of the daily activity, the daily round of work. And I say consistent, I mean it's consistent across all the different kinds of hunter-gatherers, from the Arctic down to the tropics. And that is that the women produce the or carry out the activity on which society depends on a daily basis. And in the majority of the world, what that means is that they go out and get the ordinary boring food. They get the equivalent of the rice and the potatoes and the pasta. And the men go out and get the interesting food that gives life to the boring food. So those are the meats and the honeys and those pretty much cover it in general. So that's true almost everywhere. Now, I said from the Arctic, and in the Arctic something slightly different happens, which is that the women don't produce food at all in the extreme Arctic conditions. But what they do is something almost as vital, which is they produce the clothes that men are able to go hunting in. So there's a slight difference there. Men get all the food, essentially, and it's meat and fish. And when I say meat, what it really means is not so much the protein that muscles consist of, but the blubber that surrounds the animal, and that's all the fat that humans are just desperately in need of. So that's the foraging round. And then in terms of the roles of looking after the family, it's very clear that women have the primary responsibility for the daily care of the family. And as the children grow up, then the boys get increasingly into the orbit of the men, and the boys are incredibly excited and in puberty when they are first allowed to do male things. I mean, probably they'll start out just helping make tools in camp, and eventually they'll go out and foraging with the men. So it's a very gender-structured society, because the girls stay in camp until they can go out and forage with the women in later childhood or early adolescence. And from a very early age, they are the ones who do play parenting. So elder girls from the age of probably 5 or 6 onwards may have a baby on their hip, carrying the babies in a way that a boy would very rarely do. And they're brought up to be mothers and to do domestic work around cooking. And So the cooking is an interesting question in terms of gender, because both men and women cook, but they cook in totally different ways. The women do the daily cooking. The women do the cooking of the daily meal in a way that is expected absolutely of them, so that if a husband comes home from foraging and finds that a woman has not prepared the food, then she would be in big trouble. And other people would not be surprised if the husband ends up physically beating the wife. They would say that was her fault. The men do the cooking in the public arena when there is a feast day, when there is some kind of between family, society-wide excitement. So they're hosting another camp, or they've got reasons to celebrate within their own camp. And then there will be some kind of public big fire, literally maybe in the middle of the camp area, and then men can get engaged in cooking, and typically what they're cooking is meat, and typically it'd be a big animal, and then it'll be cut up and taken to the domestic fires or around each individual family's hut or campfire, and then further prepared there by the women. So basically it's men are doing the public cooking and women are doing the private cooking.
And I heard you said the husband comes home. Well, how do the relationships work? Are there monogamous relationships, or like can one man can the alpha male have many wives? How does those relations work?
There is no alpha male, by the way.
No alpha male.
But it's true that there are men who are more respected more than others, and who are sort of ceded to in terms of their voluble opinion more than others. But nevertheless, it's not an alpha male, because an alpha male in primates is a male who can literally beat up, and does beat up, every other male.
Physically,
exactly. But that's not going to happen with
right.
humans. Or if it does, there'll be big trouble. So are they monogamous? In hunter-gatherer society, most families are monogamous. And there are some societies in which very few men are ever polygynous, and therefore very few women are polygynous. But there are others in which that's not true. And the classic is in the societies in the northern, roughly third of Australia, you find areas in which most women are married polygynously. So most women are married to a man who has other wives as well. And this is married in the sense that everyone recognizes that they are married, and the various wives have equal call on the man's resources and activities. And there you may get men who have a lot of wives, 10 wives, 15 wives, even 20 wives. So obviously that creates a tremendous problem, because that means there are a lot of men who don't have wives. It also means that there are a lot of women who aren't getting much out of their husbands. So that happens in hunter-gatherers. In the rest of the world, there's not much polygyny in Africa. There's a bit in some of the South American sites. So it varies.
And isn't it true that we have half as many male ancestors as we have females, which means each man would be with two females?
The genetic evidence, as I understand it, is that there has been pretty consistent polygyny in the human past. But most of what that is looking at, I think, is with farmers.
Oh.
And I am not sure how much people have been able to apply that to lineages just of hunter-gatherers.
Right, so it doesn't go far back enough to maybe...
Well, I should repeat that I don't know. I'm not
Right,
sure. I haven't followed that work closely.
right. Okay. Yeah, no, my guess would be that it maybe dilutes so much because I've done a DNA test and they can only go back to 500 years, for example. They can't go any further back.
Yes, that's right. The comparison of number of male and female ancestors would depend on a lot of reconstruction, a lot of calculation.
Very interesting. And are all the societies patriarchal? All the prehistoric societies, or
Yeah.
all the ones?
Well, they're not prehistoric.
Oh, right, they're not. Okay, fair. Yeah, we don't know about the prehistoric.
So they're just as modern as you and me,
Right.
but they have retained a hunting-gathering way of life for longer. And yes, there is a marked degree of patriarchy in every society on Earth. There are people who talk about matriarchy, but sometimes they are muddling it with some other kind of something like matrilocality, meaning that women tend to live in areas where they're born, or matrilineality, which means that people obtain some kind of inheritance, maybe clan inheritance, through the maternal line. But matriarchy, meaning that women are, as a group, in charge of major sections of the society's operation, that never happens. Now, hunters and gatherers are regularly called egalitarian. That is a concept that is in all the textbooks about hunters and gatherers. And it's right in the sense that the relationships among men are not marked by any man being able to be the king who can order others to do anything. They're all equal. It's not true, it's not an appropriate word for thinking about the relationships between men and women. And it's true that there's a lot of courtesy, there's a lot of very comfortable, relaxed, tolerant, pleasant, kind interactions between men and women. But that should not blind us to the fact that if there is conflict between men as a whole and women as a whole, men invariably win, that the religions are basically male biased, and that politics is male biased, and the law. And if you survey the law of small-scale societies like hunters and gatherers, you find that it is invariably biased in favor of the men. So that, for example, if you take adultery, then the punishments for adultery are always worse for women than they are for men if there is a difference between them. And many similar examples.
And why do you think in the modern world we've seen women becoming prime ministers, presidents all over Europe, in the West? Why? So why have we seen such a rise of women to power if for most of the almost entirety of human history, all societies have been patriarchal?
Well, most of the examples of women being in power are in patriarchal societies. I mean, all of them are they're examples in patriarchal societies.
Okay. Oh,
Right?
so with Angela Merkel in Germany, you'd say it's a patriarchal society still.
Absolutely.
Right.
So for one reason or another, you get a structure built up within a patriarchal society which says, well, how do we choose a leader? And for one reason or another, they may choose a woman. And it might be because of some law about inheritance that means that because of what their father was, they become the leader, or because their husband. That's very common for wives or widows to become leaders. But also nowadays you have democratic systems in which the best person for the job is, by whatever criteria, may turn out to be a woman. But that doesn't mean it's a matriarchal society. It's not. On the other hand, we are getting a move towards some limited kinds of, reduction in patriarchy, say, and to some extent some rise in matriarchy in the Scandinavian countries and in Rwanda, where you have, for the first time in the history of the world, political bodies, constitutional bodies, that are numerically dominated by women. So for about 20 years, you've had in Rwanda a parliament in which you have more female members of parliament than male.
Wow, fully democratic.
Well, not fully democratic,
Right.
perhaps, because the president, Paul Kagame, he pushed through an arrangement whereby 1/3 of the seats are restricted to being for women.
Right, okay.
But then among the remaining 2/3, sufficient number of women have been elected in a democratic way that the net result is that more than 50% of the members of parliament are women.
Wow. So it could be the first matriarchal society in the history of mankind.
That's right.
Wow.
No, and I think you're right to say it could be, because even though parliament is matriarchal in that numerical sense, the president does have a lot of power himself. So he is a man who definitely tweaks the balance of power. And then if you step outside that purely parliamentary context, then I'm certainly not an expert on Rwanda, but I would say that I'd be very surprised if you find anything equivalent in the law itself, as opposed to the parliament that makes the laws, or in the sort of informal clubs that run society within the capital and all the towns, or in the village councils. So, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the fact that we have patriarchy in our deep background consistently does not rule out the possibility of matriarchy, but matriarchy is not going to emerge purely on the basis of one kind of institution, parliament in that case, having more women than men. That's a huge help. Obviously, hardly anything could be more important, because they can change the laws that can help reduce the bias against women.
Very interesting. And why, evolutionarily speaking, why do you think men have become so? Do you think it's because of their physical dominance over women that we have patriarchal societies overall, or is it something else?
Well, I don't think it is just the physical dominance. It's quite true that men are physically dominant over women, and the degree of difference is greater than you might think, even just from looking at body weight differences, because the amount of muscle difference is greater than the body weight difference. That's because women have more fat than men. I mean, even women who are lean have more fat than a lean man. And that reflects the fact that men have relatively more muscle. So there's no question, men are physically, in general, very able to dominate men are very able to dominate women from puberty onwards. But the reason I say that does not seem an adequate explanation is twofold. First of all, if we compare our two closest relatives with each other, chimpanzees and bonobos, we see this fascinating contrast of chimpanzees being the equivalent of totally patriarchal, all males being able to physically dominate all females, and doing so. Whereas bonobos, the dominance ratings of them are kind of mixed between males and females. So you can't say that males are dominant to females, you can't say that females are dominant to males. If you look at all the different individuals, then you might find that the top individual in a dominance ranking is a female, and then the next one is a male, and the next one is a male, and the next one's a female. And they're just jiggled about like that. And the top one could be a male. So the reason I draw attention to this comparison between males being dominant in chimps and sharing a dominance in bonobos is that the degree of physical difference in body weight is the same. Males are as much heavier than females in bonobos as they are in chimpanzees. So there's something psychological as well. And that opens up the possibility that is true in humans. And I think it is true because there's lots of evidence that males are much more tending to form large groups with members of their own sex, large political groups, than females are. So this gets into sort of very delicate territory because women don't want to hear that there might be something about the sort of core evolutionary psychology that means that they are less familiar with, guided into political success. So you've got to be very careful and cautious, but nevertheless, so taking all of the caveats into account, you see from quite an early age, 4, 5, 6 years old, that boys tend to aggregate into groups in which they interact with each other a lot compared to females. There are fascinating little experiments in which you see that even at a very young age, boys interact with each other, girls put into groups of the same number, sit alongside each other and do things side by side. So the girls will each play with their own toys, while the boys are all playing with the same toy. The girls may interact with each other in terms of talking to each other, but as you expand this kind of study, what you find is that the ways in which human females and human males at any age cooperate with each other has this interesting difference, that females tend to cooperate more intensely with fewer individuals, and males tend to cooperate less intensely with more individuals. So boys have this shallow relationship that covers a wide group, and girls are much more engaged with a few who they totally trust and have a really, really strong relationship with, and less so with people outside their little clique of 4 or 5 individuals. And when you see this happening time and again at different ages and in different cultures, then it is certainly very tempting to think that there is something about male psychology that is more driven towards this larger, call it political grouping, and females more driven towards this more family-like grouping.
So men might be able to acquire skills to manage or manipulate large groups of people from an early age, as with women it's more a closer circle of people that they engage with.
Yeah, and this isn't really well studied still, but I mean, here's an example of the kind of psychological difference that might be at play. And that is that in the competitive world of politics, when you engage with lots of different people, you may have to put up with all sorts of insults, all sorts of effects of some individuals dominating you in their particular field of interest. And men, I think there's some evidence, are better at accepting that somebody else is got it over them, is higher ranking, and that's just, you've got to put up with it, than women are. Women may find it harder to accept that someone else is superior to them in terms of members of their own sex. The thought is that, that humans may be somewhat similar to chimpanzees in this respect, where chimpanzees, the males have dominance relationships in which when a male dominates his subordinate, then the subordinate comes to accept that and will greet the dominant in a way that acknowledges their difference in relationship. And this allows them to have a comfortable, cooperative relationship together. Females don't do that in the same way. They are standoffish with each other, and if there's a female there who dominates the others, then the other ones just tend to avoid her. They don't want to cooperate with her. And my reading of human psychology is that something similar tends to go on with humans too. That men find it easier to rank each other and just live with that difference than women do. And this may give them an edge in their, that may give men an edge in their ability to form large groups and sort of develop a social structure in which you have this fascinating combination of competition and cooperation.
Very interesting. Well, final question. Have you ever said anything that caused controversy in or written anything in your field or amongst people? Because there is a lot of public investment in your field, because it's the answers it can give, it can sort of change the way we look at our current philosophies of how politics should work, how we should arrange society. So yeah, has there been anything controversial you've said?
There are lots of controversies within the academic area. You know, so we talked about cooking, when there are some people who point out quite rightly that the archaeological evidence for the control of fire is inadequate, go back to when I think it happened at 1.9 million years ago, and then argue against the idea that we were cooking at that time. So you know, there are controversies like that. But have there been controversies at the level of debate in the newspapers, that sort of thing? I don't think so, really. You know, I've been always walking on eggshells. You know, I'm very much aware of the potential for misuse of these areas, and I try to write in ways that are sufficiently cautious that it makes them probably rather boring from a point of view of the public. And the big area in this respect is war. You know, so I was one of the people who were first engaged in observing chimpanzees going out into the areas occupied by neighboring groups of chimpanzees and making deliberate efforts to stalk, or wound, and ideally kill members of the neighboring group. So I wrote about that with Dale Peterson in a book called Demonic Males, and argued that humans have got a similar kind of propensity, and that we very likely have shared that with the chimpanzee lineage ever since we split from the chimpanzee lineage around 6-7 million years ago. Well, I mean, that certainly has some academic controversy, but I have really emphasized that the fact that we have this propensity to take advantage of power to attack our enemies does not mean that we are committed to that in the future. And I think it's been nice to see that that idea has not been abused. So, you know, that's good. I suppose the closest I come to having views that get represented in a controversial way in the popular arena is that I have emphasized the evidence that hunters and gatherers, the way of life of our past, have definitely been associated with war. And there are some people who find that very difficult to take and object to it, and have written about me and others like me in very aggressive terms. So
Okay.
that is a controversy that's a little bit alive.
We'll discuss all about violence next episode we have you on. It was great talking to you. I'm really looking forward to have you back on again.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mohammed. That's great. I look forward to it myself.